Alright guys, so for our first lecture video, we really just need to finish up the last two slides in chapter 6. And so that's what we're looking at here is chapter 6, and I did all the slides except for the last two. And the last two slides are really very similar to what you saw in lab in exercise 8. It's the definitions of those different categories of bone markings. And so we've actually already talked about bone markings. You know that bone markings are basically the topography that exists on each bone. So these are elevations or projections that form where muscles, tendons, and ligaments attach and where adjacent bones articulate. They can be sites where blood vessels or nerves lie alongside or penetrate the bone. And so what you need to do for exam 3 is you need to learn the name of the different categories of bone markings. I'm kind of like going over that with a little laser pointer here. And you need to know the description of the different categories. So for example, on exam 3, you can expect to see a question like, which of the following bone marking categories is a large rounded projection that may be roughened? And then the term you would be looking for is tuberosity. And then if you didn't see it, the answer would be E, the answer is not present. Okay, so again, we kind of generally talked about what bone markings are in lab, but let's just kind of go through and state the descriptions, and then we've got examples here to the right, and just make sure that everybody's clear on what they need to be learning for exam 3. Okay, so let's actually start with the bottom bone marking category called a process, because we see that term a lot when we're looking at bone markings. And so a process is any bony prominence. So for example, here's a spinous process, which is one of the bone markings that you guys are supposed to learn in lab. Okay, so then we go up here to tuberosity. A tuberosity is a large rounded projection. It may be roughened. As an example, we see the ischial tuberosity here on the coxal bone. And in these pictures, some of these bone markings can actually be a little difficult to tell, what you're looking at. But when you have that actual physical bone in your hands, it's a lot easier to kind of figure out exactly what that bone marking actually feels like or looks like. A 2D picture doesn't always necessarily do a bone marking justice. So if it seems a little confusing in a 2D picture, keep that in mind, that really you need to have the bone in front of you. And we'll see, how that affects Practical 2 moving forward. I do normally have students label bone markings, but if we end up having to do Practical 2 online, I'm going to have to take that into consideration when I'm coming up with bone marking questions, because obviously some of these can be a bit difficult to identify from simply a picture. Okay, but moving forward, our next category is a crest. Now, a crest is a narrow ridge of bone, and it's usually prominent. And the example of a crest is, again, on the coxal bones right here. It's the iliac crest. Okay. And then our next category is the trochanter. So a trochanter is a very large, blunt, irregularly shaped process. See, we're using that word process again. The only examples are on the femur. And so over here, you've got the femur bone, and they're indicating the trochanter, which again, 2D, it can be a little bit hard to identify. Next, we've got line. This is a narrow ridge of bone, less prominent than a crest. Okay, so the example of a line, again on the femur, is the intertrochanteric line. We've got a tubercle, which is a small rounded projection or process. The example of a tubercle over here is the adductor tubercle, also happens to be on the femur. We've got an epicondyle, which is a raised area on or above a condyle. Okay, right here, medial epicondyle. And then we've got the spine, which is a sharp, slender, often pointed projection. And the example back to the coxal bone is the ischial spine over here. Okay. So moving forward, again, we want to know the different categories of the bone markings, and we need to know their description. You will see those questions on exam 3. Okay. So then moving forward to our next slide is these are different categories of bone markings that help form joints. I point that out because you can see that obviously in the title. I don't ask questions like that on the exam. Like, I'm not going to ask you which category of bone markings helps to form joints. What I am going to ask you are the descriptions, and then you have to name the category. So let's walk through these. A head is a bony expansion carried on a narrow neck, and you can see there's a head over here. It's on a rib. Okay, see, there's the rib bone. And then we've got the facet, which is a smooth, nearly flat articular surface. Again, facets are also on the ribs. We've got a condyle, which is a rounded articular projection. We've got a condyle over here on the mandible. And a ramus, which is an arm-like bar of bone, also on the mandible. This area here is referred to as a ramus. Okay. So then moving down into our last category, we've got a groove. A groove is just a furrow. Okay, so if we come over here to the skull, we've got a groove there. A fissure is a narrow slit-like opening. All right, so over here, behind where your eyeballs are, there's an inferior orbital fissure. A foramen is a round or oval opening through a bone. So they're pointing to a foramen here, but there's multiple foramen throughout the different bones. We've got a notch, which is an indentation at the edge of a structure. So they're pointing to a notch here on the mandible, but if we just kind of pop up back here, that's the notch right there, that area there. So that's a little bit easier to see. Then we have a meatus. A meatus is a canal-like passageway. Okay, so here's the meatus here. If you stick your finger in your ear, you're sticking your finger in a meatus. That particular meatus is called the external acoustic meatus, which is also on your lab instructions. Okay. A sinus is a cavity within a bone filled with air and lined with mucous membrane. And you guys have already been exposed to the different sinuses, right? There are the 4 different paranasal sinuses. There's the maxillary sinus, the ethmoidal, the sphenoidal, and the frontal sinus. So up here, it's actually part of the frontal sinus, okay? And then we've got a fossa, that's our last one. So it's a shallow basin-like depression in a bone, often serving as an articular surface, and at the base of the skull here, that's where a fossa would be, okay? All right, guys, so again, for exam 3, you are going to see questions that give you the description or the definition of the bone marking category, and you need to identify the appropriate name of that bone marking category. That's what you're studying for exam 3. And I think that's the end of our first lecture video. So I'll kind of keep saying this over and over again. These 2 slides that I just covered, if you have any questions about these 2 slides, please post a question in the comments section below this particular video. I'll monitor the comments and I will answer your questions so that everybody in the class can see the answer. All right, guys, thanks.